I'm going to talk about how to control the dynamics of self-propelled particles by changing the activity and the confinement. This is a joint work with Anirudh, Ashini and Shashi from NCBS and Vijay from ICTS. So I'll give a brief introduction to what are active matters. So basically these are really consist of many active agents which are self-propelled, and due to constant energy consumption, these are noble class of non-equilibrium systems. So basically there are lots of examples of active systems like flock of birds, or these are colony of bacteria, and these are real so these are the motion of molecular motors and a microtubule. So these are real life examples, but not only the real examples, like also these active particles can be realized in the experiments also. So basically these are vibrated granular rods which behaves like an self-propelled particles, and also it shows swarming behavior. Okay, but in our system basically we will study the scalar active particles. So what are the scalar active systems? The scalar, I mean the particles do not have any orientation dependent interactions. So basically in literature there are two broad classes of scalar active systems. One is active Brownian particles, which is like model kind of a genus particle which has two hemispheres, chemically different hemispheres. When they are shined with a laser light, they behave like a self-propelled particles. You can see in the video these are like a genus particle, and they behave like a, you can see they are moving in one direction, they are self-propelled particles. There is another type of particle called run and tumble particle. Sorry. So these are basically elongated object with some flagella behind, and it has a straight path motion called run, and then it switches its orientation which is called tumble. So in our study, basically we will study about this active Brownian particle and the run and tumble particles. And in my title slide I said about effect of confinement. So basically I'll just show what is single file diffusion. So if you consider this picture, you see here there are a lot of particles inside a narrow, inside a channel, but the channel width is larger than the particle diameter, so the particle can cross each other. And in that case, if you measure the mean square displacement of any particle, it grows linearly with time. But if happens show that the channel width is so narrow that any two particles cannot cross each other, then the particle motion will be slowed down, and the mean square displacement of any tagged particle will be subdiffusive. Now the question is, why do we study this single file diffusion? Because there are lots of real life examples of single file diffusion, like water transport in a carbon nanotube, or motion of molecular motors on a filament, or ion channels through a biological membrane, and a lot more. So this kind of single file diffusion have already studied for passive particles, analytically well studied, and also in experiments also. So this is an experimental setup where this is an optically trapped passive colloids, and the mean square displacement of those particles asymptotically shows subdiffusive behavior. Now we ask the question, can we see this kind of subdiffusive behavior if we take active particles? So we have done it in experimentally. So first I will show what are our experimental setup. So basically this is our experimental setup. This is a mechanical electromagnetic shaker, and this is a head expander where we keep the particles, and this is the camera with which we take out the videos, and this whole setup is excited with a sinusoidal wave. And these are the 3D printed particles. You can see it has, this is the front view, this is the back view, this has head and tail asymmetry, and the vibration, the particles get excited on the vertical directions. So the 2D motion is actually self-propelled. So this is then zoomed view of this 2D arena. This is a zoomed view of this. Basically there is a narrow channel you can see here, and we keep the particles here. The particle position is denoted by theta, and the internal orientation of the particle is denoted by phi. So first we characterize these particles in 2D, and then we characterize it in confinement. So here I have shown the probability distributions of theta and phi, which shows a more or less flat distribution, shows that there is no preferential orientation or positions. So this is a typical experimental video. You can see here particles are kept in 2D as well as kept in 1D. We can do the experiment in 2D and 1D simultaneously. So first we characterize in the particles in the 2D. So you can see here particles, so just to remind you, phi is the internal orientation of the particle, And to characterize this, we calculate the mean square displacement of the particle for both the internal orientation as well as the position. So, and also we repeat this experiment for different amplitude of the vibration, and this amplitude we represent it in terms of a dimensionless quantity relative acceleration due to, relative to gravity. F is the frequency of the oscillation. You see here the mean square displacement source linearly grows linearly with time at small time and grows ballistically with time in the longer time scale. And these are the for different relative accelerations of the head of the shaker. And the mean square displacement of the position, it shows super diffusive behavior in the small time scale and the diffusive behavior in the long time scale. So given this kind of property, one can model it as a active chiral particles which are all studied. So basically, so these are the, to model this kind of systems, these are the equation of motion of the particle, this is the position equation, R equation, and this is the equation for the internal orientation. So you can see there are active speed term, there is translational diffusion constant, chirality, and the rotational diffusion constant. So given the experimental data, our aim is to first to get these active parameters. So how we do it? So the delta phi square mean square displacement is like this. And also, so we saw it in the from the experimental data that linear behavior and the ballistic behavior. Given those kind of behavior, we calculate what is the chirality from the experimental data, and also we calculate rotational diffusion constant. Also from the position, the mean square displacement in position, we calculate the active speed and also the translational diffusion constant. So you see active speed grows slowly with the relative acceleration of the shaker, but actually what we can really control here is the noise strength. You can see here the rotational diffusion constant, it increases with the amplitude or the relative acceleration, as well as the translation diffusion constant also increases with the amplitude. So basically here we, by changing the relative acceleration of the shaker, we control the noise strength and the activity parameter. Here we just show the Peclet number, which is a strength of the activity which goes down. Now given this properties of the particles in 2D, what we can say in 1D. So this is a typical video of the particles in 1D confined in the channel. So here just to remind you, theta is the position of the particle and phi is the internal orientation, and see how the trajectories, typical trajectories look like. So if we plot phi minus theta, you can just follow this video. The particle first moves in one direction and then suddenly it flips in the other direction, which you can see actually from the trajectory itself. You see there are motor-like jumps here, and also if you see the trajectories in the theta, you see there are jumps in the theta trajectory. And also you calculate the mean square displacement of the theta, which shows super diffusive behavior. So due to confinement, the particle dynamics changes and the particle behaves like a run and dumbbell particles because of confinement. So next question. So how do we model this kind of system? We first, okay. So this flipping behavior, we try to characterize flipping behavior. To do that, we first plot phi minus theta, and there we see it is there are double peak which occurring at minus pi by 2 and plus pi by 2. So which shows that the particle orientation or in orientation space, it feels a potential which is a double well, and since phi and theta are periodic, we can so the particle feels a periodic double well potential. For simplicity, we take a cos potential. So these are the equation of motion for the particles. You can see these two equations which are very similar to the 2D equation, except there is a potential term, and we take the potential term like this, such a way so that the peaks comes around plus minus pi by 2. Then we calculate the flipping time distribution, which is Poisson distribution, calculated from the experiments as well as in the simulations. We calculated the flipping time, and the flipping time goes down with the relative acceleration. So by changing the relative acceleration, we can change the particle activity. Now next question is that can we so what we have shown is that in 2D the particle behaves like an active Brownian particle, and in 1D due to confinement particle behaves like an run and tumble particle. Now the question is that can we see a smooth transition from run and tumble particle to an active Brownian particle experimentally? So to check that, we have another head expander where we have 3 channels with different channel widths. The innermost one is the narrowest channel and the last one is the widest channel, and check how the trajectories look like. So from the trajectory itself, it's very clear that this is the innermost one and there are jumps in the theta, jumps change in the slope in the theta, and you see for the widest channel, it trajectory looks like more like diffusive. So you can see there, but just by varying the confinement, we can tune the particle nature from run and tumble particle to active Brownian particle. We also studied the interacting particle characteristics, but so these are the typical trajectories, but I will not go into the detail because of time constraint, but just to show here, for passive system I told there is subdiffusive behavior observed in the experiments. Here also we see, so the transition time from the superdiffusive behavior to the subdiffusive behavior, it really depends on the rotational diffusion constant. So with the particle with high rotational diffusion constant, within the experimental time scale we see subdiffusive behavior, but with another kind of particle which has small dr, small rotational diffusion constant, within the experimental time window we do not see subdiffusive behavior. So yeah, that is all I have. So I will just summarize here. So experimentally we realized self-propelled particles in single file, the particle dynamics changes due to confinement, the noise strength and activity parameters can be controlled by changing the relative acceleration, and finally the particle nature can be tuned from run and tumble particles to active Brownian particles by varying the channel width. Thank you.
Questions?
Theta minus phi distribution. Yeah, so what is phi and what is theta here?
Okay, theta is the position of the particle and phi is the internal orientation of the particle.
Internal orientation of the particle. So what I was curious about, how this theta and phi are related. I assume that theta and phi are independent variables.
Are this one.
Yeah.
This one.
So I assume that phi and theta are independent variables, but your equation shows that phi and theta are coupled,
but,
right?
when you write the active Brownian particle, there is a theta dependent, right? Active propulsion.
That I understand, but your equation says that phi and theta are somehow related, right?
Yes, they are related.
So what is the reason for that?
Because this is confined and these are restricted to move on a circle, so it's restricted. So there must be a relation because this is on a ring. But if it is in like what is that? It is a, if it is not a ring, then it will not be.
Means what should be the, I mean, which?
So the particle, if you look at these videos, this video you can see that since it is in 1D, it has the orientation changes by pi, exactly by pi. It's in confinement, so the it cannot have the like the phi changes exactly by pi. It's not a continuous number like 2D run and tumble particles.
So when you are having this active Brownian motion, so in that case, even I think even if you introduce some obstacles within the confinement, when you are having a bigger width, I guess you might end up with some single file diffusion. This is just my guess.
Get your point.
So basically, what we are having in this case, we are having a very narrow channel.
Yes.
In another case, you are showing that when the width of the channel increase, and in that
behavior comes just because of the constraint that particle cannot cross each other.
Exactly. So basically, so even by introducing some obstacles within the channel.
Obstacle in a sense, like you mean the passive object, passive
yes.
particle. Yes, you will.
Yes,
show.
yes.
It will show subdiffusive behavior. Yes.
So how do you drive it? So what kind of
sinusoidal wave? Yeah.
the stochasticity is because
The vibration.
Because the vibration
Yes.
is supposed periodic.
Yes.
So stochasticity is because of the shape of the particle. Is it that momentum transfer is?
That's because, yeah, why it is self-propelled. Yeah, that is because particles are asymmetric. So it is self-propelled because of that.
But if I had like completely spherical particles,
It will be still be self-propelled, but it will not be, it will be still be self-propelled, but it will not be active in a sense like it will not have persistence motion.
the question was that
So that's how we realize the passive particles in exactly this setup. Like just symmetric particles.
the question was the membrane is moving completely deterministically, right? So where is the stochasticity coming in? In this case, because the shape is, because the momentum transfers can be.
Sir, can you please discuss it afterwards, because one more question is coming and then.
Well,
That's fine.
two things. One is, have you played with the particles? Like, you're just using one kind of particle and then you studied the dynamics, right?
Sorry, sir.
But what if you change, the property of the self-propelled particle?
Property
You prepare
in
like
sense?
different particle.
I have
different propulsion
results with
velocity.
different type particles.
Yeah.
So if you see the mean square displacement, here I have two set of particles with different types of
You
different
observe
parameters.
similar behavior, like
Yeah.
subdiffusive
But,
behavior. And
so here subdiffusive behavior, to reach the subdiffusive regime, it will take more time, depending upon the rotational diffusion constant.
Right. One more. So have you played with the shape of the channel, shape of the the ring? It's like perfectly symmetric, right?
Yes.
So what if you just make it irregular, like irregular channel, irregular channel?
Irregular in a sense like elliptic.
No, your channel, whatever the ring, that is symmetric, right? It's perfectly symmetric, right? So what if you just make some, make an irregular channel?
Are you asking about the changing the channel width irregularly?
Shape,
or
channel shape.
I don't think if we change it smoothly, I don't think
No, it should change because you're changing the entropy, right? Like you change if you change the shape of the channel,
yes.
then the degrees of freedom are
Okay, I
different.
can't comment on it.
You
I
don't
don't have
well.
the result. I mean, I haven't checked.
Okay.
Okay, we'll like to pause here, and if you want any more discussion, you can always catch Pritha around, and let us thank her once again. And on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank all the speakers of this session, and we conclude the technical session for today here.